I now give the floor to Ms. Roza Otunbayeva.
Devastating earthquake struck the country's southeast. Like the earthquake that recently struck several eastern provinces of the country. At that time, I visited the site, met with victims, and discussed cooperation with local de facto authorities. I saw the desperation of the people affected and their need for assistance, as well as the efforts of local de facto authorities. I urged the international community to provide funds, and the United Nations family selflessly worked in cooperation with de facto authorities to provide immediate and then long-term aid. Several months later, however, the de facto authorities issued a ban on higher education for women, exacerbating the existing ban on secondary education, as well as a ban on Afghan women working for NGOs, later extended to United Nations organizations. These decisions show the different trends vying for influence within the de facto authorities. One that is more pragmatic and oriented to the needs of Afghan people, and the other more focused on the creation of what is described as a pure Islamic system. And that has placed increasing restrictions on the Afghan people. In view of the lack of pragmatism, members of the international community increasingly ask how much they should support a country whose leaders undermine their population. This is most clear regarding the de facto authorities' policies towards Afghan women. After 3.5 years of the closure of girls' schools beyond grade 6, a generation is at serious risk of being lost at a huge long-term cost to the country and causing enormous concern and despair among Afghan society as a whole. A recent survey by the UN Women found that the vast majority of Afghans oppose the ban on girls' education. The World Bank estimates that it costs the economy $1.4 billion per year. I have spent the past 3 years advocating for engagement with the de facto authorities based on the mandate given by this council and the demonstrated willingness of the pragmatic faction to improve the lives of Afghan people and relations with the international community, and on the evidence that progress through engagement can be made on some issues for the benefit of the Afghan people. Unanimous engagement built on the groundwork laid prior to my appointment, shortly after the Taliban takeover, when cooperative discussions allowed for the provision of humanitarian assistance. The de facto authorities made commitments on human access and the safety and security of humanitarian workers and compounds. In December 2021, this Council adopted Resolution 2615 that clarified the provision of humanitarian and basic human needs assistance did not violate financial sanctions outlined in the United Nations 1988 sanctions regime. The United States issued General License 20 in February 2022 that authorized all financial transactions involving Afghanistan or governing institutions in Afghanistan, except for certain listed individuals. These measures helped avert famine and likely saved thousands of lives during that first uncertain winter. These exemptions continue to have a positive impact on the Afghan people, enabling sustained humanitarian and basic human needs responses. Since 2021, the international community has provided nearly 13 billion US dollars of international assistance, 7.9 million for humanitarian funding, and 4.9 billion for basic human needs. Despite some reports to the contrary, for the most part, this has been distributed without major interference. The United Nations has strengthened risk management and monitoring systems to minimize the risk of aid diversion. The United Nations also assumed responsibility for handling cash shipments required for humanitarian operations, necessary at a time when Afghanistan was facing severe fiscal and liquidity crisis. Without these early cash shipments, the humanitarian response would have collapsed with catastrophic consequences for the Afghan people. I would like to point to a few positive developments since August 2021 and the takeover by the de facto authorities. Afghanistan has experienced a notable decline in large-scale armed conflict and violence, resulting in a relatively stable security environment across much of the country. Despite ongoing challenges such as the presence of extremist groups, widespread humanitarian and economic hardship and human rights concerns. The ban on poppy cultivation has generally been sustained since enforcement began in the spring of 2023. This has benefits for the region and globally, and should benefit the Afghan people over time. In the short term, however, the ban's impact on many poor rural Afghans who relied on poppy cultivation for their livelihoods, and in some provinces were the early supporters of the Taliban as an insurgency, has been devastating. This population now criticizes the de facto authorities for not doing enough to provide alternative livelihoods, risking a renewed increase in poppy cultivation and for detaining poppy farmers. The announcement by de facto authorities of a general amnesty in August 2021 was also constructive. UNAMA continues to document cases where the amnesty has been violated. Each violation is reprehensible and should be addressed, but the general compliance is encouraging after decades of a brutal war. In 2022, the Taliban leader issued several texts aligned to certain international human rights obligations, including decisions prohibiting torture and on the right to defense lawyers. While much remains to be done on the rights and treatment of detainees, constructive engagement between UNAMA human rights teams and the de facto office of the prison administration has allowed and facilitated human rights teams access to all 34 prisons countrywide, where they regularly conduct visits and engage with detainees. Some states are still seeking to repatriate Afghans who worked for them during the Republic era in their own countries. The UN is also aware that several states are negotiating with the de facto authorities on the return of Afghans from their countries to Afghanistan. While doing so, we continue to urge member states to refrain from involuntarily returning individuals at risk of human rights violations to Afghanistan, and to increase the availability of safe pathways for Afghans at risk to leave the country. In support of engagement the UN's comprehensive approach based on Security Council Resolution 2721 and under the Doha process seeks to maintain a basic international consensus on Afghanistan through two lines of effort: working groups advancing collective efforts on counter-narcotics and enabling the private sector, and secondly, building confidence among stakeholders and the mosaic approach. It provides the only multilateral framework for engagement between the international community and the de facto authorities, and a political pathway to address the complex issues blocking Afghanistan's reintegration into the international system, which ultimately must be based on the de facto authorities acting on basic international obligations. If advanced, this framework could allow for Afghanistan to reach its full economic potential and develop its human capital for both men and women. Mr. President, the development of Afghanistan's full potential is required for the country to address the multiple and simultaneous crises it is currently facing. The main lines are: first, the growing number and enforcement of restrictions against men, women, girls, and minorities, particularly by the de facto propagation of virtue and prevention of vice inspectors, is giving rise to increasing popular discontent with the de facto authorities. People are telling us that the Taliban leadership should instead focus more on issues that matter most to the Afghan people: jobs, the economy, education, and public services. Second, aid cuts of almost 50% in 2025, with the likelihood of further reductions next year. It is another reason. It must be acknowledged these cuts are partly the result of Afghanistan's anti-women policies. Third, a struggling economy whose 2.7% growth rate is below the population growth rate, not counting the recent returns. Currently, 75% of the population lives at subsistence levels, a serious situation compounded by recent significant cuts to the public sector. Fourth, an emerging drought and other climate-related stressors, including natural disasters such as the recent earthquake in eastern Afghanistan. Afghanistan's economy is primarily agricultural, its population majority rural, many of whom are subsistence farmers. A drought presents an existential threat. Water shortages have already led to significant internal migration, which creates additional stress factors on the socio-economy. Water also affects urban populations. In the next years, not decades, Kabul, a city of almost 6 million, could become the first modern city to run out of water. 5, significant population returns from neighboring countries that are stressing existing socioeconomic coping mechanisms. More than 2 million Afghans have returned in the past 2 years, with 1.8 million people since the beginning of this year alone. Unlike the wave of returnees in late 2023, limited international resources are available to assist in the reception and resettlement of returnees. I have been to Afghanistan's border with Pakistan and Iran and seen how the de facto authorities are doing what they can with very limited resources they have to receive their returning citizens. These returns have also caused the economy approximately $1 billion in remittances. It is an open question whether there is sufficient pragmatism among the de facto authorities to manage this perfect storm of crisis, or whether decisions driven by ideology will prevent sustainable solutions, extending the suffering of Afghan people and undermining existing stability. We have been evidence of both trends recently. In response to the Kunar earthquake, de facto authorities mobilized helicopters to evacuate the wounded, coordinated with international agencies and countries, providing bilateral aid, set up sites for internally displaced people, and in other ways addressed the immediate and medium-term needs of the affected communities. At the same time, as United Nations agencies were ramping up their support for earthquake victims while continuing their assistance to the returning crisis, personnel from the de facto Ministry of Defense deployed outside UN compounds in Kabul, preventing access of our female national staff. Similarly, personnel from the de facto Ministry of Interior's Directorate in charge of protecting the United Nations have blocked access for female national staff to UN field office premises around the country. This serious restriction hinders the UN's ability to help the Afghan people at their moment of great need. I visited Kunar several days ago. The devastation caused was much greater compared to the other two Paktika and Herat earthquakes in the past 3 years. I was struck by this deep tragedy and by the generous support of the international community. International financial institutions such as the World Bank and Asian Development Bank are also involved in mobilizing funds for basic human needs and services. But these IFI-funded projects must be implemented through UN agencies, and their impact has been reduced by the enforcement of bans against female national staff and the wider ban on women working, which has created unacceptable discrimination. We have issued a statement calling for the lifting of this ban and its enforcement, and I urge the Security Council to echo our call. Mr. President and members of the Council, as I prepare to leave Afghanistan in a few days, I'm certain that most Afghans want engagement between the international community and their country to continue, despite the obstacles. It is my fervent hope that the pathway can be agreed for this engagement to continue and for it to begin yielding more positive results, especially for women and girls in Afghanistan.